We continue our studies on the 12 disciples, or the 12 apostles as they are often referred to. So far, we have considered Andrew and Bartholomew. Remember that we are studying the disciples in alphabetical order, so there's no favoritism applied in my analysis of them. Today, we meet James. There were 2 disciples among the 12 who had the name James. We will meet the other James in our next study. The James we are considering today was one of the little-known disciples. He is the disciple we know least about. The New Testament tells us nothing about him apart from his name and the name of his father and mother. He lived in Galilee. He preached in Palestine and Egypt and was crucified in Egypt according to tradition. Tradition also tells us that he died as a martyr and his body was sawn in pieces. The saw became his apostolic symbol. James is identified as a son of Alphaeus, Matthew 10, verse 3. James is not the only disciple to have a father called Alphaeus. We discover another reference to Alphaeus in Mark 2, verse 14. And there Levi was the son of Alphaeus, as we read it. Now Levi was identified as Matthew, and we'll come to that later on when we look at Matthew. If we assume this to be the case, then what it means is this: James and Matthew were brothers. Now you might say, so what? Is there any significance to this? I think there is. A little closer analysis helps us. In the lists of the disciples, the last 4 named are James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. Since these 4 are consistently named together, there must have been something that they had in common that actually brought them together as a group. Simon was a zealot, a fanatical Jewish patriot. Judas Iscariot was a patriot. There is evidence that Thaddeus was a zealot. So it's reasonable then to deduce that James, the other member of this gang of 4, were bound together because they shared similar views. They had a similar outlook on the political situation. These men, assuming James was one of them, they had a bond of intense and fanatical patriotism, and it's quite fair to say that they may all have at one time belonged to the zealot party. If James and Matthew were brothers, we can see immediately how opposite they were. Matthew, and we'll have more to say about this in a future study, he had been a tax collector serving in an administration that was subject to the powers of Rome. James had probably become a fiery nationalist who hated anyone who compromised with Rome. These brothers, even though they belonged to the same family and were subject to the same parental influences, ended up hating each other. James regarded Matthew as a traitor. James was sorely tempted to plunge a dagger into his brother Matthew. There was no love lost between them. Each harbored bitterness and resentment against each other. Then something amazing happened. Jesus came on the scene. What a difference he made. Incredibly, he called both of them to be his disciples. In the presence of Jesus, that man of peace, Jesus made these brothers one. They were reconciled. What an amazing transformation that was. There they were, hating each other up until this point in their lives, and now, by both following Jesus, not only did they have a relationship with Jesus himself, but they had a wonderful relationship as brothers themselves. Their hatred of each other immediately disappeared. The fact that both James and Matthew were members of the disciple band is a great illustration of why Jesus came into the world. He came to reconcile people to each other. This is a timely message for our world, where many people are the victims of bigotry, racism, and hatred, which have festered for generations. One example of this hostility is between Israelis and Palestinians. Another example is the sectarian conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, where I grew up. Terrorists from each side of the conflict in Ireland have, in an amazing way, come together. Not because they have agreed politically, but because they have now a common faith in Jesus. They are now followers of him. And as a result of that, they are reconciled to each other. An ex-terrorist in Northern Ireland said this: "Since I've become a Christian, I love the people I used to hate." If such reconciliation occurred in our families, how much better life would be. Unfortunately, I encounter so much family conflict in my pastoral work. It's very sad to have to say this, but there is a fairly significant proportion of my time that has to be spent dealing with conflict between people and within wider families. Humanly speaking, some of these relationships are beyond the prospect of reconciliation. But I always retain the hope that divided families, even though there has been bitterness, alienation between them, maybe for a generation or more, that they can still be reconciled through faith in Jesus Christ. Isn't it a wonderful thing to know that if we follow Jesus, then we can indeed be reconciled to others who maybe hated us because they follow Jesus as well. James is identified as James the Younger, or the Lesser, or the Little. The reason why we chose the passage from Matthew 15 today is not because we're coming up to the end of Holy Week, but because there is a reference to James here in verse 40. There were also women looking on from afar, among whom were, then there's a list of them, Mary Magdalene, and then we have, and Mary, the mother of James the Younger. This distinguishes him from the other James, the other disciple, the son of Zebedee, either because he was shorter in stature or younger in age than his namesake. Although no single incident is recorded in the Gospels about James, his name is preserved for us as one who was chosen to be a disciple of Jesus. There must have been something about James which prompted Jesus to include him among the 12. Those men who were sent forth to preach the gospel, to heal the sick, and cast out demons. It would appear as if he never caused Jesus any anxiety by backsliding or unfaithfulness. It would appear that he exercised a quiet, faithful, effective, and unrecognized ministry. James did nothing extraordinary as a disciple, at least nothing that was considered worth recording in the Gospels. There's a helpful lesson there for us. Faithful and patient service often goes unrewarded and unnoticed by people. J.B. Jones describes a visit he made to Lincoln Cathedral. The guide pointed out the two towers adorning the west front of that magnificent building. After describing the beauty of the architecture and the extraordinary detail of the work, he added, "And no one knows who built them." Some of the most beautiful work in Lincoln Cathedral was done by an unknown tradesman who was faithful in carrying out his work and content that people should forget him and look at his work instead. His piece of amazing beauty lives on to this day, and it will last for generations to come. There are many missionaries who work in lonely, isolated places. There are many Sunday school teachers, visitors to lonely and needy people who get on with their work every day. Few of them get any recognition. Their work lives on. Even when no one mentions them by name, the work that they have done still has a telling effect. This should be a great encouragement to all of us. Conscious that his duties would be lowly and obscure, James faithfully discharged them. I hope we will do the same. Our service may not be remembered in this world, but it will be recorded in heaven forever.